The day my family turned their backs on me, I was wearing the blue dress they'd always complimented, a cruel irony that wasn't lost on me as I stood in my sister's immaculate living room, surrounded by the people I'd given up everything to protect. "We've made our decision, Charlotte," my sister Elaine said, her voice steady and cold, her manicured hands folded neatly in her lap. "It's time for you to move on. We've done enough." I stared at her, then at my brother Paul, who couldn't even meet my eyes, his gaze fixed on some point beyond my shoulder. My nephew Tyler, now a young man of 23, scrolled mindlessly through his phone, as if his aunt's heartbreak was nothing more than a boring television show he was being forced to sit through. "Enough?" I repeated, the word bitter on my tongue. "You think this is about what you've done for me?" My name is Charlotte Mercer, and at 48 years old, I was about to learn that a lifetime of sacrifice could be dismissed with a few callous words and averted gazes. "Be reasonable," Elaine continued, brushing an invisible speck from her designer pants. "We've let you stay with each of us for months now. You need to find your own place, get back on your feet. After everything." I started, my voice catching. "After everything I gave up for this family." "Ancient history," Paul finally spoke, still not looking at me. "That was your choice, Charlotte. Nobody asked you to put your life on hold. Nobody asked." The casual rewriting of our shared history struck me like a physical blow. I thought about the full scholarship to Columbia I'd declined when our parents died unexpectedly, choosing instead to work 2 jobs to keep us together, to put Paul through college, to make sure Elaine could finish high school with her friends. I thought about the promising career I'd abandoned to care for our dying grandmother, about the relationship that fell apart because I was too focused on family responsibilities. Nobody asked. But they had needed, and I had given, and now that I was the one in need, my savings depleted by medical bills, my apartment lost after the layoff, they were showing me the door. "I'll be gone by tomorrow," I said quietly, dignity the only thing I had left. "There's no rush," Elaine said, her tone suggesting the exact opposite. "Take until Monday." Today was Friday. Such generosity. "You still haven't told her," Tyler suddenly spoke up, finally looking up from his phone. Elaine shot him a warning glance, but the damage was done. "Told me what?" I asked, looking between them. Paul cleared his throat, fidgeting with his wedding band. "We're selling grandmother's house. The paperwork was finalized yesterday." The breath left my lungs in a painful rush. Our grandmother's Victorian on Maple Street, the house I'd maintained for years, where I'd nursed her through her final illness while my siblings built their lives elsewhere. The house that, according to her will, belonged to all 3 of us. Without consulting me? I managed. "You weren't exactly in a position to handle business matters," Elaine said dismissively. "The opportunity came up suddenly, and we had to move quickly. Your share of the proceeds is being held in escrow until you get settled." Until I get settled. The circular logic made me dizzy. I needed my share to get settled, but I couldn't have it until I was settled. "I see," I said, though I didn't. I didn't see at all how the people I'd raised, protected, and supported could look at me with such cold detachment. "Will you at least tell me how much the house sold for?" "Just over market value," Paul said vaguely. "The money should tide you over until you find something permanent." If they were being straight with me, if they were giving me a fair third, it would indeed be enough to start over. But the evasiveness in Paul's eyes told me there was more to this story. I straightened my shoulders, suddenly bone-tired of fighting for scraps of the love and loyalty I'd given so freely. "I'll be gone by tonight," I said, turning toward the guest room that had been my temporary shelter. Don't worry about dinner. I won't be joining you. Charlotte, Elaine began, a flicker of something, guilt? Concern, crossing her perfectly made-up face. But I was already walking away, my back straight, my heart crumbling to dust with each step. As I packed my meager belongings into the same 2 suitcases I'd arrived with 3 months earlier, I caught sight of myself in the dresser mirror. The woman staring back at me looked tired, diminished, nothing like the vibrant, hopeful girl who had once put her family above all else. Who was she now, this Charlotte Mercer without a purpose, without the identity of family caretaker that had defined her for so long? I didn't know. But I was about to find out. What I couldn't have known then, as I wheeled my suitcases past my silently watching family and out into the gathering twilight, was that fate had already set in motion a series of events that would bring a different kind of justice than anything I could have imagined. And that one day, sooner than any of us could have predicted, my siblings would desperately need the very person they had so casually discarded. The red roof in off the interstate wasn't exactly rock bottom, but I could see it from there. I sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, counting and recounting the cash I had left. $342 wouldn't get me very far, but it would buy me time, a week in this motel, maybe 2 if I stretched it, while I figured out my next move. My phone buzzed with a text from Elaine. Left some groceries and a check in a bag by the front door. $1,000 to help until you're on your feet. $1,000. A fraction of what my share of the house should have been, but more than I had now. Still, something stopped me from rushing back to collect this offering. Pride, maybe. Or the sinking feeling that accepting their handout would somehow validate their treatment of me. I didn't respond. Instead, I opened my laptop, one of the few possessions I'd managed to hold on to, and began searching for jobs, housing, anything that might help me rebuild from the ashes of my former life. After an hour of scouring listings far beyond my current qualifications, a knock at the door startled me. Cautiously, I peeked through the peephole, then flung the door open in surprise. Marissa? Marissa Chen, my best friend from college, one of the few connections I'd maintained through the years of family obligation, stood there with a paper bag in one hand and a determined expression on her face. Tyler called me, she said by way of explanation, stepping past me into the room. That kid always did have more of a conscience than his mother. Told me what happened. Said you might need a friend. Relief and gratitude flooded through me as Marissa set down the bag and pulled out a bottle of wine and 2 plastic cups. I don't know if this helps, but I brought provisions, she said, pouring generous amounts into both cups. And a proposition. I accepted the wine, taking a larger sip than I intended. I'm in no position to refuse propositions right now. Marissa settled into the room's only chair, studying me with the direct gaze that had intimidated and impressed me since our freshman year. My office manager just quit. Gave exactly 0 notice. I need someone organized, detail-oriented, and capable of handling both clients and my perpetually disorganized self. I blinked, processing her words. Are you offering me a job? I'm offering you a lifeline, she corrected. The pay isn't amazing, but it includes benefits. And the apartment above my garage is sitting empty since my last tenant moved out. It's yours if you want it, rent negotiable until you get back on your feet. Tears sprang to my eyes, the kindness almost more painful than my siblings' rejection. Marissa, I don't know what to say. Say yes. Then help me finish this wine, because I've had a day from hell, and your family drama is actually a welcome distraction from my own catastrophes. I laughed for what felt like the first time in months. Yes. To all of it. Thank you. She clinked her plastic cup against mine. Don't thank me yet. Wait until you've seen the horror show that is my filing system. Later, as we sat cross-legged on the motel bed sharing the Chinese takeout Marissa had also brought, she asked the question I'd been avoiding. What happened with the house, Charlotte? The grandmother's place? I sighed, setting down my carton of lo mein. They sold it. Without telling me. Said they're holding my share in escrow, but... I shrugged. Something doesn't add up. They're being evasive about the details. Marissa frowned. That doesn't sound right. The house was in all three of your names, wasn't it? According to the will, yes. But I never saw the actual deed after the estate was settled. Paul handled all that. He's the one with the business degree, after all. The bitterness in my voice surprised even me. First thing tomorrow, we're going to the county records office, Marissa decided. If something shady happened with that house sale, we're going to find out. I nodded, though part of me wondered if it was worth the effort. Even if my siblings had cheated me somehow, what recourse did I have? I couldn't afford a legal battle, and the emotional cost of prolonging this conflict seemed too high. Maybe it's better to just move forward, I said hesitantly. Take the job, the apartment, start fresh without looking back. Marissa's gaze sharpened. Is that the Charlotte Mercer I know? The one who fought the university administration for better student housing? The one who organized that protest when they tried to shut down the women's center? That was a long time ago, I said softly. Before everything. Before you let your family obligations swallow you whole, Marissa corrected. But that woman is still in there, Char. The fighter. The one who doesn't back down from injustice. I wanted to believe her. For a brief moment, I felt a flicker of the fire that had once burned so brightly in me, the determination, the righteous anger, the refusal to be anyone's doormat. One step at a time, I said finally. Job first. Apartment. Stability. Then we can look into the house situation. Marissa nodded, seemingly satisfied with this compromise. Speaking of the apartment, why don't we go get your stuff from that depressing motel room and move you in tonight? The place is furnished, nothing fancy, but better than this. As we gathered my belongings, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, hope. Not the desperate hope of someone drowning, grasping at anything that might keep them afloat, but the tentative hope of someone seeing solid ground after a long time lost at sea. Whatever had happened with my family, whatever betrayal had occurred, I wasn't alone. And maybe, just maybe, this unexpected turn of events was the push I needed to reclaim the life I'd set aside for too long. The following morning, after my first night in Marissa's garage apartment, a cozy one-bedroom with surprisingly good light and a small balcony overlooking her garden, we drove to the county records office. The process of searching property records was tedious but straightforward, and within an hour, we had our answer. I don't understand, I said, staring at the documents in front of me. This says Paul became sole owner of the house 5 years ago. How is that possible? The clerk, a sympathetic woman in her 60s, pointed to a line in the deed transfer. Looks like there was a quitclaim deed filed. Both you and your sister signed over your rights to your brother. But I never signed anything like that, I insisted. The clerk gave me a look that suggested she'd heard similar protests before. Well, according to these records, you did. Here's your signature, notarized and everything. I studied the signature, a cold feeling settling in my stomach. It looked like mine, but I had no memory of ever signing such a document. Can I get copies of all of this? I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Armed with the records, Marissa and I sat in a nearby coffee shop, spreading the papers across the table and examining them closely. "This is fraud," Marissa said bluntly. "You never signed this. Someone forged your signature." I nodded, the pieces falling into place. 5 years ago. That's when grandmother was in the hospital for that bad pneumonia. I was staying at the house, barely sleeping, running between there and the hospital. Perfect time for Paul to slip something in with a stack of medical forms or insurance paperwork, Marissa mused. You were exhausted, distracted. Might not have read everything carefully. The betrayal cut deeper than I could have imagined. Not just that they'd shut me out now, when I needed them, but that they'd been planning this for years. While I was caring for our grandmother, sacrificing my time and energy for the family, my own siblings had been setting up this betrayal. "What do you want to do, Charlotte?" Marissa asked quietly. I stared at the documents, emotions warring within me. Anger. Hurt. A bone-deep weariness at the thought of yet another battle. "I don't know," I admitted. Fighting this would mean hiring a lawyer, proving the forgery, dragging all our family business through the legal system. "And they deserve that," Marissa said fiercely. "They stole from you, Charlotte. They took advantage of your dedication to family to commit fraud. That's not just morally wrong, it's criminal." She was right, of course. But the thought of facing my siblings across a courtroom, of publicly declaring our family broken beyond repair, filled me with a sadness so profound it almost overshadowed the anger. "Let me think about it," I said finally. "Right now, I need to focus on rebuilding my life. New job. New home. One step at a time." Marissa clearly wasn't satisfied with this answer, but she nodded. "Your decision. But keep those documents safe." "And Charlotte?" Her expression softened slightly. "Remember that you deserve justice, even if it comes at the expense of people who clearly didn't value you the way they should have." As we drove back to Marissa's house, a notification lit up my phone. A news alert from our hometown paper. Curious, I opened it, then felt the blood drain from my face. Prominent local businessman Paul Mercer under investigation for investment fraud. "Oh my God," I breathed, scanning the article. "Marissa, pull over." She guided her car to the side of the road, glancing at me with concern. "What is it?" "Paul," I said, still reading. "He's being investigated for running some kind of Ponzi scheme. They're saying he defrauded investors of millions." Marissa's eyes widened. "Holy shit." The article detailed allegations that my brother had been taking investment money from clients of his financial advising firm and using it to pay returns to earlier investors, while skimming substantial amounts for himself. The house, our grandmother's house, was specifically mentioned as an asset that investigators believed had been sold to fund Paul's increasingly desperate attempts to keep the scheme afloat. "This explains everything," I said, pieces clicking into place with devastating clarity. Why they were so eager to get rid of me. Why they sold the house so quickly. They needed the money to cover Paul's tracks. Or to fund their escape, Marissa suggested grimly. "Does it say if he's been arrested?" I scanned the rest of the article. "Not yet. But it says the investigation is ongoing and charges are expected soon." We sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the implications. "Do you think Elaine knew?" Marissa finally asked. I thought about my sister's coldness, her evasiveness about the house sale, the way she couldn't quite meet my eyes when discussing the proceeds. "Yes," I said quietly. "I think she knew everything." The realization should have brought some satisfaction, vindication that my instincts about their deception had been correct. Instead, it just deepened the ache in my chest. My siblings hadn't just abandoned me, they had betrayed everything our family had once stood for, everything I had sacrificed to preserve. What now? Marissa asked, pulling back onto the road. I looked out the window at the passing scenery, feeling strangely detached from the emotional hurricane that should have been raging inside me. Now, I said slowly, I start my new job. I learn to live for myself for once. And I let whatever's going to happen with Paul and Elaine happen without me getting dragged back into their mess. Marissa glanced at me, clearly surprised by my response. You're not going to confront them? About the house, about any of it? I shook my head. What would be the point? They made their choices. I made mine. Now we all have to live with the consequences. Little did I know how prophetic those words would prove to be. 3 weeks into my new life, I was beginning to find my rhythm. Marissa's office was chaotic but energizing, full of creative people working on architectural projects that transformed spaces and lives. My apartment, while small, felt more like home each day as I added small touches, a vintage lamp here, a colorful throw pillow there, books lining the modest shelves. For the first time in decades, I was living solely for myself, making decisions based on my own needs and wants rather than those of my family. The sensation was both liberating and disorienting, like learning to use a muscle that had long been dormant. The news about Paul continued to unfold like a slow-motion car crash. He hadn't been arrested yet, but the investigation had expanded. More victims coming forward. Larger sums mentioned. His face appeared on local television, once confident features now haggard with stress as he ducked into his lawyer's office, refusing to comment. I hadn't heard from either of my siblings since I left Elaine's house that evening. Their silence spoke volumes, guilt, perhaps, or simply the continued conviction that I was expendable, not worth considering now that they had their own crises to manage. Then came the day everything changed again. I was at work, organizing the chaos of Marissa's filing system, when my phone rang. Unknown number, but the area code was from my hometown. Hello? I answered cautiously. Aunt Charlotte? Tyler's voice, strained and unfamiliar. It's me. Something in his tone sent a chill through me. Tyler? What's wrong? It's Mom, he said, his voice breaking. And Uncle Paul. There was an accident. My blood ran cold. What kind of accident? They were in Uncle Paul's car. Police think he was driving too fast, lost control on the curve by Miller's Pond. The car went into the water. He paused, struggling to continue. Mom's in the ICU. Uncle Paul, he didn't make it. The world tilted sideways. Paul, dead. Elaine, critically injured. Despite everything they'd done, everything that had happened between us, the news hit me like a physical blow. Where are you now? I managed to ask. At Mercy Hospital. Mom's in surgery. They're saying it doesn't look good. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of history and family ties pulling at me. I'll be there as soon as I can. After a quick explanation to Marissa, who immediately offered her car and insisted I take as much time as needed, I was on the road back to the town I'd left less than a month ago, my thoughts a tangled mess of grief, anger, and confusion. Paul was gone. My little brother, who I'd helped raise after our parents died, who'd once followed me around like a shadow, whose college tuition I'd worked double shifts to help pay. Despite his betrayal, despite everything, a piece of my heart broke at the thought of his life ending so abruptly, so violently. And Elaine. My sister, once my closest confidant, now fighting for her life after years of growing distance and recent treachery. What would happen to Tyler if she didn't survive? What would happen to any of us? The 3-hour drive gave me too much time to think, to remember. Paul at 7, gap-toothed and determined to learn to ride the bike I'd saved up to buy him. Elaine at 13, letting me brush and braid her hair while we talked about her latest crush. The three of us huddled together at our parents' funeral, holding each other up when it felt like the world was collapsing around us. Where had those siblings gone? At what point had they transformed into the people who could so callously discard me, who could commit fraud and theft without apparent remorse? And why, despite everything, was I driving back to them now? The hospital was a maze of sterile corridors and hushed voices. I found Tyler in the surgical waiting room, hunched in an uncomfortable chair, his face pale and drawn. He looked up as I approached, relief washing over his features. "Aunt Charlotte. You came." "Of course I came," I said, sitting beside him. "Any news?" He shook his head. "She's still in surgery. They're saying it could be hours." I nodded, taking his hand in mine. Despite his mother's coldness toward me, Tyler had always been a good kid. A bit spoiled, perhaps, a bit oblivious to adult complexities, but fundamentally decent. "I'm so sorry about your uncle," I said softly. Tyler's face crumpled. "They're saying he was trying to run. That he emptied accounts, packed bags. The police found a passport with a different name in his briefcase." He looked at me, confusion and hurt in his eyes. "Why would he do that? Why would he leave us?" I sighed, wondering how much Tyler knew about his uncle's activities, about the scheme that had apparently been unraveling around them all. "Your uncle made some bad decisions," I said carefully. "He got himself into trouble, and he was probably scared." "Did you know?" Tyler asked, his gaze sharpening. "About what he was doing? Is that why they made you leave?" The directness of the question caught me off guard. No, I didn't know specifics. But I knew something wasn't right with how they handled grandmother's house. I paused, studying his face. "Did you know about that, Tyler? About them selling the house that was supposed to belong to all three of us?" Guilt flickered across his features. "Mom said you'd agreed to it. That you were happy with the arrangement." Another lie. I wasn't surprised, just weary of the seemingly endless layers of deception. "I never agreed to anything," I said simply. "I never even knew they'd transferred the deed to Paul years ago, let alone that they were selling it now." Tyler's face fell. "I'm sorry, Aunt Charlotte. I should have questioned it more. I should have." "It's not your responsibility," I interrupted gently. "You're not the parent in this situation, even if you are an adult now." He nodded, though he didn't look convinced. "Still. The way they treated you, it wasn't right." We fell into silence after that, the sterile hospital sounds washing over us as we waited for news about Elaine. Hours passed. I got coffee for both of us, made Tyler eat something from the vending machine, fielded a call from Marissa checking in. Finally, a surgeon appeared, looking tired but cautiously optimistic. "Ms. Mercer?" she asked, approaching us. We both stood. "I'm Charlotte Mercer, Elaine's sister," I said. "This is Tyler, her son." The surgeon nodded. "Your sister made it through surgery. The next 24 to 48 hours will be critical, but if she stabilizes, her prognosis is cautiously positive." Relief washed over me. "Thank you, doctor." Can we see her? She's in recovery now, then she'll be moved to the ICU. Family can visit briefly once she's settled, but she won't be conscious for some time. After the surgeon left, Tyler and I sat back down, the tension of waiting replaced by the exhausted aftermath of prolonged stress. You should go get some rest, I told him. I'll stay and call you if anything changes. He shook his head. I can't leave. Not until I see her. I understood that feeling all too well, the fear that if you turned your back, even for a moment, you might lose someone forever. It was the same fear that had kept me at our grandmother's bedside for weeks, that had driven me to sacrifice my own needs for my family's over and over again. So we waited together, this nephew who was nearly a stranger to me now, bound by blood and history and the complicated love of a fractured family. Hours later, we were allowed into Elaine's room in the ICU. She lay still and pale against the white sheets, connected to machines that beeped and hummed, keeping her alive. Her face, always so carefully made up, was bruised and swollen, nearly unrecognizable. Tyler broke down at the sight of her, turning away to compose himself. I approached the bed slowly, taking in the sister who had cast me aside, who had participated in deceiving me, who had left me to fend for myself when I needed her most. Yet standing there, I felt none of the bitter satisfaction that might have been expected. No sense of karmic justice or vindication. Just sadness for the brokenness of it all, the lives cut short or forever altered, the trust shattered, the family bonds severed. I reached out and took Elaine's limp hand in mine. I'm here, I said quietly, though I didn't know if she could hear me. I'm here, Elaine. And I was. Despite everything. Despite the betrayal and abandonment. Despite having every reason to walk away as they had walked away from me. I was there, fulfilling the role I'd always played, the one who showed up, who sacrificed, who held the family together even when it seemed beyond repair. But this time was different. This time, I was there not out of obligation or a misplaced sense of duty, but out of choice. Because sometimes, the truest test of character isn't what you do when you've been wronged, but what you do when those who wronged you are suffering. In that sterile hospital room, holding my sister's hand while monitors beeped and machines breathed for her, I made a decision. I would be there for Elaine and Tyler now, during this crisis. I would help them navigate the aftermath of Paul's death, of whatever legal and financial chaos his schemes had created. I would be the family they needed in this moment, but when the crisis passed, if Elaine recovered, if life found a new normal, I would return to the life I was building for myself. The boundaries would be clear. The sacrifices would have limits. And the relationship, if it continued at all, would be on new terms, terms that honored my worth rather than exploiting it. It wasn't forgiveness, exactly. Some betrayals cut too deep for simple forgiveness. But it was a choice to rise above the hurt, to be better than the treatment I had received. To break the cycle rather than perpetuate it. Tyler returned to the bedside, his eyes red-rimmed but composed. What happens now? He asked, his voice small. I squeezed Elaine's hand once more before releasing it. Now we wait. We hope. And we take one day at a time. He nodded, settling into the chair beside his mother's bed. I took the one near the window, watching as darkness fell over the hospital parking lot, as lights came on in windows across the way, as the world continued spinning despite the personal earthquakes that had shaken our family to its foundations. The room was quiet except for the steady beep of monitors and the mechanical whoosh of the ventilator. In that quiet, I felt a strange peace descend, not because justice had been served or wrongs had been righted, but because I had found my own center in the midst of chaos. I had made my choice from a place of strength rather than obligation. Whatever happened next, whether Elaine recovered or not, whether we rebuilt some version of family or went our separate ways, I would face it as the woman I'd rediscovered. Not the doormat, not the perpetual caretaker, but Charlotte Mercer in full, strong, compassionate, and finally putting her own oxygen mask on first. 3 days into our hospital vigil, Elaine opened her eyes, her gaze, disoriented and panicked, landed on me sitting beside her bed. Recognition dawned slowly, followed by confusion, then something like shame. Char. Latte, she rasped through cracked lips, the ventilator having been removed the previous evening. I'm here, I said, reaching for the cup of ice chips the nurse had left. Don't try to talk too much. You're in the hospital. There was an accident. Memory flickered in her eyes. Paul? I shook my head slightly. I'm sorry, Elaine. He didn't make it. She closed her eyes, tears seeping from beneath her lids. Whether she cried for Paul or for herself, for their shared secrets or separate griefs, I couldn't tell. Tyler, who had been sleeping in the other chair, jerked awake at the sound of voices. Mom? Mom, you're awake. He rushed to her side, taking her hand, his face alight with relief and love. Their reunion brought tears to my own eyes, a reminder of the genuine bonds that still existed within our fractured family. I'll give you two some privacy, I said, standing to leave. Elaine's eyes flew open, her hand reaching weakly toward me. Don't go, she managed. Something in her expression stopped me, a vulnerability I hadn't seen in years, a desperate need that went beyond physical weakness. I'll just be in the hall, I assured her. I'm not leaving. Not yet, anyway. In the days that followed, as Elaine's condition improved and she was moved from the ICU to a regular room, the full extent of Paul's deception began to come to light. Investigators interviewed Elaine multiple times, though her lawyer insisted these sessions be kept brief due to her medical condition. The picture that emerged was both simpler and more complex than I had imagined. Paul's Ponzi scheme had indeed been unraveling for months. Elaine had known about it, had even helped cover his tracks to some degree, though she claimed ignorance of the full scope of his activities. The accident that killed Paul and nearly claimed Elaine's life hadn't been an escape attempt, as initially reported. They had been on their way to meet with Paul's lawyer to discuss surrender terms. The high speed, the recklessness, that had been panic, not a planned flight. And the house, our grandmother's house, had indeed been sold to pay back some of Paul's earliest investors, the ones he was most afraid would go to the authorities. But it had sold for far less than its true value in the rushed, desperate transaction. I'm sorry, Elaine told me one afternoon, when we were alone in her hospital room. For everything. For letting Paul manipulate me. For turning my back on you when you needed us. For all of it. I studied my sister's face, now regaining some of its color, the bruises fading to yellows and greens. Why, Elaine? After everything we've been through together, everything I did for you and Paul, how could you treat me that way? She looked away, shame evident in the slump of her shoulders. It happened so gradually. Paul kept saying you were holding us back, that your constant sacrifices were a form of control. That if we really wanted to be successful, we had to break free from the family narrative you'd created. The words stung, even though I recognized them as the manipulations they were. And you believed him? Not at first. She sighed. But he was so convincing, so certain. And then there was the money. Once we started seeing the returns he promised, it was intoxicating. The life we could have. The freedom. She looked back at me, tears in her eyes. I lost sight of what really mattered. Of who had always been there for us. It wasn't enough. A deathbed, or near deathbed, apology couldn't erase years of manipulation and betrayal. But it was something. A crack in the wall of justifications, a glimmer of the sister I had once known and loved. I don't know if I can forgive you, I said honestly. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But I'm here now because that's who I've always been. The one who shows up. The one who doesn't abandon family, even when they've abandoned me. Elaine nodded, tears streaming down her face. I don't deserve you. No, I agreed, my voice gentle but firm. You don't. But that's not why I'm here. I'm here because this is who I choose to be. Not who you or Paul or anyone else made me. In that moment, something shifted between us, an acknowledgement of truth, a crack in the facade of justifications and denial. It wasn't reconciliation, not really. But it was a start. A clearing of the air that had been polluted by lies and manipulations for too long. As the weeks passed and Elaine's recovery progressed, I found myself at a crossroads. My leave of absence from Marissa's firm was coming to an end. My apartment, my sanctuary, awaited my return. The life I'd begun to build, interrupted by this family crisis, pulled at me. And yet, there was Tyler to consider. Just 23, suddenly facing his mother's lengthy recovery, his uncle's criminal legacy, and the practical realities of managing a household thrown into chaos. You're leaving, aren't you? He asked one evening, as we sat in Elaine's living room after visiting hours had ended. I nodded, seeing no point in evasion. I have a job, an apartment, a life I've started building. I can't abandon that. I understand, he said, though his expression suggested otherwise. It's just. I don't know how to handle all this on my own. The old Charlotte would have immediately put her plans on hold, would have sacrificed her nascent independence on the altar of family needs yet again. But I wasn't that Charlotte anymore. You're not alone, I said, choosing my words carefully. I'll help coordinate Elaine's recovery plan before I leave. I'll be a phone call away. I'll visit when I can. But I can't stay indefinitely, Tyler. He nodded, understanding in his eyes despite his disappointment. You deserve your own life. After everything you've given up, you deserve that much. That night, as I packed my things in the guest room that had briefly been my home before my exile and unexpected return, I reflected on the strange, painful journey of the past 2 months. I had lost my job, my apartment, my financial security. I had been betrayed and abandoned by the siblings I'd sacrificed everything for. I had watched one of them die and nearly lost the other. Yet somehow, impossibly, I felt stronger than I had in years. More certain of who I was and what I wanted. More committed to building a life that honored my own needs alongside my compassion for others. The next morning, before leaving for the 3-hour drive back to my new home, I stopped at the hospital for one final visit with Elaine. She was sitting up in bed, color returning to her face, the physical evidence of the accident fading even as the emotional scars remained fresh. So this is it, she said quietly as I settled into the chair beside her. You're going back. To my job. My apartment. Yes, I confirmed. But not forever. I'll come back to visit. Elaine nodded, accepting this new reality, one where I was no longer the ever-present safety net, the sister who would drop everything to meet family needs. I don't deserve your forgiveness, she said after a moment. But I hope someday I might earn back some small measure of your trust. I studied her face, searching for the manipulative sister who had participated in my exile, who had stood by while Paul defrauded me of my inheritance. Instead, I saw only a broken woman, humbled by loss and her own near death, genuinely reckoning with the consequences of her choices. I hope so too, I said honestly. For both our sakes. Before I left, Elaine handed me an envelope. The insurance company called yesterday. Paul's life insurance, the legitimate one, not the ones tied up in his schemes, it named both of us as beneficiaries. This is a copy of the policy. Your half should be enough to start over properly. I accepted the envelope, not bothering to look inside. Whatever the amount, it wouldn't replace what had been taken from me, not just financially, but emotionally, in trust and family bonds. But it was something. An acknowledgement, at least, of what I was owed. Thank you, I said simply. As I drove away from the hospital, from the town that had witnessed both my greatest sacrifices and my deepest betrayals, I felt a strange lightness. Not happiness, exactly, there had been too much loss and pain for that, but something like liberation. The ties that had bound me, the obligations that had defined me, seemed less constricting now. The insurance money, as it turned out, was substantial, enough to secure my future in ways I hadn't thought possible a few months earlier. I used some to buy a small condo near Marissa's office, invested some for retirement, and set aside a portion for Tyler's education. The rest I kept liquid, a safety net against future uncertainties. Elaine recovered slowly but steadily. The legal consequences of her involvement in Paul's schemes were mitigated by her cooperation with authorities and the fact that she'd been on her way to surrender when the accident occurred. Community service, probation, restitution payments, a punishment, certainly, but not the prison term she might have faced. Our relationship evolved into something new, not the close bond of our youth, not the dysfunctional dynamic of recent years, but something cautious and respectful. Monthly phone calls. Occasional visits. A careful rebuilding of trust where possible, an acceptance of changed circumstances where it wasn't. Tyler thrived in ways that surprised us all, stepping up to manage household affairs during Elaine's recovery, returning to college with a new sense of purpose. He visited me often, building a relationship with his aunt that existed independently of his mother's influence. And I discovered that Charlotte Mercer, freed from the role of perpetual family caretaker, had talents and interests long suppressed. I excelled at my job with Marissa, eventually becoming a partner in her firm. I made new friends, took art classes, traveled to places I'd always wanted to see. Sometimes, in quiet moments, I still wondered about the roads not taken, the career I might have had if I'd accepted that scholarship, the family I might have raised if I hadn't been so consumed with caring for the family I already had. But those thoughts came with less regret now, more acceptance of the choices I'd made and the woman they had shaped me into. The universe had indeed delivered its own form of justice, though not in the way anyone could have predicted. Paul, the architect of so much deception, had paid the ultimate price. Elaine had faced legal consequences and the near loss of her own life. Both had been forced to reckon with the moral bankruptcy of their choices. But the truest justice, I came to realize, wasn't in their punishment. It was in my liberation. In the discovery that I could survive betrayal, abandonment, loss, and emerge stronger, wiser, more wholly myself than I had ever been while sacrificing everything for others. My name is Charlotte Mercer, and at 48 years old, I finally learned that the greatest sacrifice I could make for myself was to stop sacrificing everything for others. That lesson came at a terrible cost, through paths I would never have chosen. But in the end, it gave me something precious, a life that was finally, truly my own.